Welcome, Ed Woodson.
Thank you very much, Barry. And good job, by the way. I'll keep you on a little longer. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, this is what we talked about. We talked about a lot last time. In fact, I was kind of surprised at how far I got. And that was last time, and we finished up with the Columbian Exchange. That pretty well takes care of the major topic as far as Christopher Columbus is concerned. Although he pops up again sometimes by way of subsidiary topics that we'll be getting to maybe today. Okay, so today we're getting back to some good old political history. Good old political history, always my favorite. And the main topic of today, in the first part of the period anyway, is who will succeed Isabella and Ferdinand. Talked about their marriage and that whole bit. And when Isabella, there's Isabella, when Isabella and Ferdinand, there's Ferdinand, he doesn't look too happy there, does he? Married back in 1469, Isabella continued the ruling Castilian house of Trastamara. That was the name of her dynasty, Trastamara, which was founded by Henry II exactly 100 years before. So she was continuing that dynasty, which was the ruling family, the ruling house, if you will, of Castile. All right? Henry II was Isabella's great-great-grandfather. I think I've got the right number of greats there. Now, because of the complicated nature of Spain's political disunity, due to the many kingdoms, I've talked to you about this before. This is a map that shows all the different kingdoms of Spain. There's no Spain yet. You don't see Spain anywhere on that map, I don't think. But all of those different colors are different kingdoms. And of course, Castile includes all of this green area and all of this blue area here. This is Castile. And Madrid, which became the capital, of course, is right smack dab in the middle. And that was Isabella, the house of Trastamara. And Ferdinand, he's the king of Aragon, which is, nothing to laugh at, but it's certainly no Castile, is it? And that's why sometimes I have to catch myself. I'll say Ferdinand and Isabella, or I should be saying Isabella and Ferdinand. Okay? The two monarchs, not only because of the many kingdoms, is this whole story complicated, but the two monarchs' relationship to each other was somewhat complicated also. They knew how important it was to set about having children, to ensure an easy succession to the throne upon their deaths, as all monarchs basically do. This was especially true for Isabella. It was more true for Isabella, I should say, than it was for Ferdinand, because Castile was so much more important than Aragon. As we have already seen in our study of European history, monarchs often arranged marriages of their offspring to enhance their foreign policy. Having children was an extension of their foreign policy, and marrying them off is the way they put things into action. For Isabella and Ferdinand, their foreign policy goal was to isolate their traditional enemy, France. So they set about trying to ensure the long-term political stability in Spain by arranging strategic marriages for each of their 5 children. They had 5 children. So they had some to work with here. Now, not all of them will live to adulthood, but most of them did. This turned out to be quite an adventure, as you shall see. Fasten your seatbelts, it's a bumpy ride. And it's a good thing, I hope you bought a program on your way in. Because there are many players and they all look alike, and they don't even have numbers on their back, so it's going to be tough. Pay close attention, take good notes. The firstborn daughter, her name was Isabella, named after her mother. She was known as Isabella of Aragon, but later she was called Isabella of Portugal. All right? As required by a Spanish-Portuguese treaty, she was required to marry Alfonso. All right, here's Isabella. And she was required, according to the terms of this treaty, to marry Alfonso in 1490. He was the Prince of Portugal. 5 years her junior. In fact, the marriage was arranged, and they first met when he was 5 and she was 10. Okay? And everyone believed this union would forge important ties between these two neighboring countries, which could lead to an enduring peace between Spain and Portugal. Future alliance and patch up, because of a future alliance, and patch up problems caused by Portugal's support of Isabella's rival to the throne of Castile earlier. Now, in spite of the fact that it was a somewhat forced marriage, Isabella and Prince Alfonso quickly fell in love with each other. But he died in a horseback riding incident before becoming King of Portugal in 1491. In fact, this scene here, and I'm sorry I couldn't get a better one, but here he is lying on his deathbed here, and you see there's a little picture of a horse up here. He's being booted from the horse up here. Doesn't come out too, there are no other pictures I could find of him. Now, after his death, and since his father was still alive, he was Prince of Portugal. He never became King of Portugal when he's dead. So the King of Portugal sent Isabella back to her home, back to her parents in Spain. And upon arrival, she told them that she never wanted to marry again. Had it with marriage, never going to marry again, and wanted to enter a convent, wanted to live the life of a nun. Okay? Now, she mourned Alfonso's death for the rest of her life, and believed, this is going to not be comfortable news to very many people, but believed that the reason he died was God's punishment of Portugal for harboring Jews previously expelled from Spain. Many of the Jews went to Portugal, although later they'll be expelled from Portugal too, but as you will see, but you're about to find out. But she often engaged in self-starvation, self-flagellation as punishment for becoming the Queen of Portugal. But in these political marriages, these were too important. These political marriages of the sons and daughters of monarchs were just too important. So she was convinced by her parents in 1497 to marry Manuel I. Manuel I, who was the King of Portugal, her dead husband's uncle. All right? She agreed to do this under the condition, one condition, and that is that the Portuguese king expel all Jews from Portugal. The Jews were not popular in Europe at this time. Okay? At least those who had not converted to Christianity, which he agreed to do. So in 1498, Isabella of Portugal, now Isabella of Aragon, as she became known, gave birth on August 23rd, 1498, to her only child. The only child they had, his name was Miguel de Paz. Miguel de Paz, the Prince of Portugal. Perhaps because of her constant fasting and self-denial, or the constant traveling during the advanced stages of her pregnancy, she died within an hour of giving birth to her son. Her son Miguel was later recognized as the heir presumptive by the courts of Portugal, Castile, and Aragon, which means we had a chance here to unite the most important kingdoms of Spain with Portugal in one monarch, and that would be this little boy that was born to Isabella. Unfortunately, and by the way, Isabella asked to be buried dressed as a nun, to be interred at the convent of Santa Isabella in Toledo. Unfortunately, Manuel's chance to become King of Castile ended with Isabella's death, and the primary hope of uniting all of the Iberian kingdoms vanished when Prince Miguel himself died just shy of his second birthday. He only lived 23 months. Okay? And that was in the year 1500. He died in the arms of his grandmother in Granada. Isabella the First of Spain. So ended Ferdinand and Isabella's first attempt to forge ambitious foreign policy by arranging a marriage with their oldest offspring, Isabella of Aragon. So they're gone. Back to Ferdinand and Isabella there. An attempt which almost hit the jackpot, but they still had 4 more children to go. So they redoubled their efforts. You have to feel sorry for these children, don't you? They couldn't have been happy about all this. I don't see how they could be. All right? Most of them probably grew to resent the whole process. I know I would. Okay? But who am I? Well, anyway, on with the story. Next comes an unusual but famous royal double wedding. You don't see too many of those. There aren't too many double weddings anywhere, are there? I mean, what bride is going to allow anybody else to take any of her day? The most important day of her life, supposedly. Okay. Isabella's second daughter, her name was Juana of Castile, or Joanna in English. I often switch back and forth between English and Spanish names. Please, sorry about that. She married a man named Philip, who was known as Philip the Fair or Philip the Handsome. And I'll let you be the judge. Okay? He was the son of the Holy Roman Emperor, which was kind of a big deal back in those days, although not as big as you might think. And we'll talk about that when we get to Germany. His name was Maximilian I, a member of Europe's most powerful family for centuries, that we're going to say a lot about later. Of course, I'm talking about the Habsburg family. We'll be saying a lot about the Habsburgs, even starting here in Spain.
Ed, was this one called a loco?
No, not yet. Well, yeah, she will be. Loca. Female. Loca. Loco. Male. Loca. Woman. Okay? Perhaps, in fact, throw out the perhaps, the most powerful family in Europe, thus making all their descendants, likewise, Habsburgs. And let me tell you, if you lived at that time, you wanted to be a Habsburg. Although there were some really outstanding disadvantages to that too, that we'll get to also. All right? Soon. Let's see. This ensured an alliance with the Holy Roman Empire, an important but not so powerful. It was a far-reaching territory which would help assure Spain's future political security. More on Juana and Philip later. So I'll come back and talk, because their story will continue. But we got to get rid of all the other brothers, all of her brothers and sisters first, okay? Let's see. The second half of this famous double wedding, remember I said it was a double wedding on the same day. The second half of the double was the Catholic monarch's only surviving son, Juan, or John, the Prince of Asturias. Asturias is one of those kingdoms you saw. It's in the upper left-hand corner, the northwest corner of Spain. He married Margaret of Austria, also a Habsburg. The Habsburgs really ruled Austria, okay? Further strengthening ties with the Habsburg dynasty, who also ruled Austria, as I just said, upon which Spain in the future next century and a half, Spain will rely heavily in the coming years, very heavily. Okay, for them. The fourth child was Maria of Aragon. She married Manuel I of Portugal. We just met him a little while ago, didn't we? But remember, his wife died. So she agrees to marry Manuel I of Portugal, her deceased elder sister's widower. Are you following along with me here? Yeah. There's going to be a quiz on this at the end, so you better be paying attention here. Rebuilding the link forged by her elder sister Isabella's marriage to Alfonso and Manuel. Manuel and Maria were married on October 30th, 1500. She had 10 children, 8 of whom reached adulthood, which is a pretty good batting average for those days, including King John III of Portugal, Holy Roman Empress Isabella, and Beatrice, the Duchess of Savoy, in a kingdom in Italy. During her life in Portugal, Maria was almost continually pregnant, as you might imagine. Normally, she had but a few months' pause between delivery and her next pregnancy. This state of affairs resulted in continual kind of deterioration of her health. And after the delivery of her 10th child, she was reportedly exhausted to a point that she was also temporarily mentally confused before she recuperated. She died in Lisbon on March 7, 1517 as a result of her last pregnancy. Okay. Isabella and Ferdinand's 5th child was, of course, Catherine of Aragon. Now that should ring a bell. That should ring a bell. You already know about her because we covered it when we were in England, didn't we? She married Arthur, the Prince of Wales, who was the son of King Henry VII and brother of who became King Henry VIII of England. Remember? Remember that? Well, you remember what happened. He dies just a few months later, and then she married his younger brother, Henry. Shortly afterward, after he became King Henry VIII of England. There's Hans Holbein's famous portrait of him. In 1509, remember, he had to get a dispensation to marry Catherine. The Pope all said okay because there's a biblical injunction against marrying the widow of your brother. And the Pope granted the dispensation, and then later on, when Henry was upset with Catherine because she only gave him a daughter instead of a son, that's started the English Reformation. I don't have to go over that all again now, do I? You remember that all, don't you? All right, very good, very good. So that, of course, Henry's displeasure with Catherine led to the English. But it was his daughter who did become queen, didn't she? She became Mary the First, or Mary Tudor, or the Protestants referred to her as Bloody Mary. Okay? But she only ruled for about 4.5 years before she died. So let's say goodbye to the children. Despite the cleverness and forethought that went into Isabella and Ferdinand's matchmaking, there's a lot of work here. I mean, everything I've covered so far in the last 17 minutes took years and years and years of labor and negotiations and treaties and how much is the dowry going to be and who gets the dowry and when is the dowry going to be. I mean, you just can't imagine what all the work that went into this. But despite all of that, a series of tragedies, some already mentioned, conspired to prevent any and all of the Catholic monarchs, that's what Ferdinand and Isabella were often referred to as, the Catholic monarchs, prevented any and all of their children from ever reaching the throne of Spain. Isn't going to happen. Sad, sad story. The most significant tragedy was the death of their only son, and therefore the next in line, they only had one son, and the only son was, of course, Juan, the Prince of Asturias, just talked about, who died at 19 in 1497. There's a belief, I'm trying to be delicate here, people back in those days, their knowledge of human sciences was lacking. And they believe that he may have died from sexual excess. Okay? Although I must confess ignorance here, I don't know anything, I don't know exactly how that happens. Okay? He deeply loved his passionate red-haired wife so much that doctors encouraged the newlyweds to sleep apart temporarily. But Isabella replied, I quote, "I cannot separate those whom God has joined together." Within a few weeks, Juan collapsed and died of what we aren't sure, but hopefully not from too much sex. Others speculate it may have been, I don't know, tuberculosis is one of the theories. But this unfortunate death profoundly changing the course of Spanish history. One Spanish historian called his sarcophagus at Avila little town, little village north of Madrid, the tomb of Spain. Since the crown would technically pass to the daughters of Isabella and Ferdinand. But the only one left, perhaps this is a little unfair to say because it's not what's going to happen. And the next two monarchs will bring Spain its greatest glory. The two that turned out to be not the children, but the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren turned out to be Spain's two greatest monarchs. So, but they didn't know that, did they? How would they know? But let's continue the story, all right? I said we would come back to Juana. Kind of an interesting story here. Juana of Castile, or Joanna, if you will, upon the death of her brother Juan, became the first in line to succeed her mother, Isabella I, the Catholic queen, the Queen of Castile. Her spouse, who she married in 1496, the aforementioned Philip the Handsome, and once again, you can be judge. He was the Duke of Burgundy. Burgundy is a kingdom in France, a French duchy, and he was the Archduke of the House of Habsburg, and was a notorious womanizer. I guess he wasn't worried about dying of too much sex, okay? And she, well, here's how one historian put it, referring to Juana. She who, it was said, could boast but few personal attractions. Which I guess is a polite way of saying she wasn't much to look at, okay? Was plunged into deep despair, bordering on madness, during his many trysts with other women. Between 1498 and 1507, she gave birth to 6 children, 2 boys and 4 girls, all of whom grew up to be either emperors or queens, which I talked about earlier. But because of her mental instability, the royal heiress acquired the moniker Juana la Loca, Juana the Crazy One, Juana the Mad, Joanna the Mad. When her mother Isabella died in 1504, in the 30th year of her reign as Queen of Castile, it was with a bitter realization that the great kingdom of Castile, for all intents and purposes, de facto Spain, but not de jure Spain, for all intents and purposes, she was bitter about this realization that this great kingdom and all of its possessions, which included the New World now, with all the gold and silver starting to trickle in, would go to a mentally unstable daughter and her playboy husband. Ferdinand, upon the death of Isabella, retained Aragon. He's still the king of Aragon. And in her last will and testament, Isabella did a curious thing. She appointed her surviving husband, Ferdinand, as the regent for Joanna to rule in her stead, because she considered her already, before she died, incapable. And this became not only a likely event, but it's what happened, her incapacity to rule. The queen made clear her wish to keep Castile the most powerful, even perhaps at the expense of the fragility of the much heralded union of Castile and Aragon, by stating that all of those, as I'm quoting here, all of those lands discovered and yet to be discovered, conquered or yet to be conquered, shall remain the possession of my kingdoms of Castile and Leon. So she kept them as part of Castile, but turned the keys to the kingdom over to her husband, Ferdinand. In effect, the union between the two regions of Castile and Aragon was temporarily dissolved because the dynastic link through Isabella ended with the regency of Ferdinand, who of course was not Castilian but Aragonese. He was from Aragon. Meanwhile, Juana and her spouse resided in the central French duchy of Burgundy. They didn't even live in Spain. They didn't live on the Iberian Peninsula. To complicate matters, Fernando soon married the beautiful and talented Germaine de Foix, the teenage niece of the King of France. There's Germain. Once again, I'll let you be the judge. Okay. His goal here was simple. Fernando hoped, prayed that he would sire an heir who would inherit Aragon and thus end the union with Castile. Fortunately for everyone, except for poor Juana, her beloved husband, apparently she was very understanding of his many affairs with other women. Philip died suddenly just 2 months later in September of 1506, leaving her 6-year-old son, whose name was Charles, and he's known as Charles of Ghent. Ghent is a kingdom in the Netherlands. Leaving him as the heir to the throne, which he will inherit as Charles I, as also the heir to Castile. But here, the story becomes a little macabre. In fact, a lot macabre. Upon hearing the news of her husband's death, Juana collapsed even further into mental illness. Following the advice of a monk who claimed, don't ask me why, who claimed that Philip was not really dead. Philip, her husband, was not really dead. She started touring the country with his body. This very strange funeral cortege traveled by night for the next few months, the hearse drawn by 8 black horses, followed by torchbearers, a train of attendants, and the queen, Juana. In another gruesome touch, Juana occasionally opened the casket to inspect the decomposing corpse. And here's a painting of this event. Here's Juana la Loca, and here's the coffin that she opened from time to time. At last, she relinquished the body for burial at Tordesillas and went into seclusion at a nearby palace. Here she would spend the next 46 years. 46 years, bouncing from periods of lucidity to deranged melancholy, as dead to the world as Philip's body, lying in the monastery beside her. And through it all, until her death in 1555, she technically remained the Queen of Spain, the Queen of Castile, at least, but wasn't considered that since her son had become King Charles I. Of almost all of Isabella and Ferdinand's possessions, and then many others. And by the way, this story of Queen Juana la Loca has attracted authors, composers, and artists, particularly during the 19th century Romantic movement in literature and the arts. With her qualities of unrequited love and moral fidelity, later authors would focus on the grief-stricken woman and her mental illness and her exclusion from the throne that technically she was entitled to. Included in these works are one opera, several novels, films, and a TV show in Spain. One of the films, produced in 2001, won the equivalent of 3 Spanish Oscars. They have their Academy Awards too, I guess. By the way, they were Best Actress, Best Wardrobe, and Best Makeup and Hair were the 3 Oscars that the film won, okay? Okay. King Ferdinand was persuaded to return as regent. As mentioned before, it is said that Machiavelli chose him as the model for the perfect prince in his famous political treatise, and Fernando lived up to the image by adroitly playing one foe off against another to serve his ends. There's a famous story that when the French king complained that the Spaniard had lied to him twice, Fernando boasted, "I did no such thing. I lied to him at least 10 times." In 1512, Fernando annexed the kingdom of Navarre, completing the unification of the lands that pretty much comprise Spain today. The mighty Castilian army would make its presence felt on the battlefields of Europe for the next century, remaining undefeated. And Isabella died in 1504, as I said, with Juana succeeding her in name only due to her mental incapacity. So her son, the 16-year-old Charles of Ghent, became King of Castile, but his grandfather Fernando ruled as his regent for just a few years. But Fernando died in 1516 without a surviving son and heir to Aragon. His remains were taken to, this is Fernando now, his remains were taken to the Royal Chapel at Granada. There's the Royal Chapel, how it looks today, where his remains lie next to his first wife, Isabella. Here are the two coffins that house Isabella and Ferdinand. Together they left Spain on the threshold of world power and cultural glory. Ever since, many Spaniards have looked back at the reign of the Catholic monarchs, as they were called, as an era of innocent grandeur before the burdens of empire came crashing down on a nation ill-prepared to face them. According to rumor, the medications Fernando took to increase his virility, because remember he was trying to have an offspring with his second wife, actually probably hastened his death. Moreover, the results were disappointing, as his only son with Germaine de Foix died at birth. As fate would have it, and after all of this time, both Castile and Aragon would fall to the same heir, the just mentioned Charles of Ghent, or Charles I, son of Philip and Juana, the grandson of Isabella and Ferdinand. Upon his arrival, the irrepressible Cardinal Cisneros, Isabella's confessor, took charge as regent, hoping to head off any attempts by the nobles to rally around Juana la Loca. When his authority to do so was questioned, he simply pointed to a row of cannons in the courtyard and said, "There's my authority." And it worked, because he was recognized as the temporary regent, and Charles will be recognized as the king. Charles I, he'll rule from 1516 to 1556. He will later become the Holy Roman Emperor, and he will be known as Charles V of the Holy Roman Emperor. Here's a famous portrait of him by Titian. Charles I is perhaps one of the most, if not the most, powerful monarchs in European history. The amazing thing is he acquired his power virtually without firing a single shot, although many others did before and after him to hold on to it. In fact, it could all be chalked up to sheer luck. He was lucky to be born into the most powerful family of Europe, the Habsburgs. He may be the only monarch to have a candy bar named after him. At least I don't know of any others. A very popular candy bar, by the way, in Mexico. You'll find them everywhere in all of the stores. Okay. Carlos V, Charles V. Okay. Now, before we go much further, let's talk about the House of Habsburg. We'll come back. We'll say a little bit about it now, and then we'll come back and talk more about it when, as I said, when we're in Germany. But we can't go much further here without, you got to know a little bit about the House of Habsburg. The house takes its name from Habsburg Castle. Habsburg Castle is in the canton of Aargau in Switzerland. This is the little town of Aargau, and this castle right here is known as Habsburg Castle. Here's a close-up of it. Kind of a nice place. Hope you agree. A fortress. This is a fortress built in the 1020s. So it's over 1,000 years old. In present-day Switzerland, and it was built by Count Radbot of Klettgau, who changed the name of his fortress to Habsburg. He chose the word Habsburg from either the word for hawk, Habrik, excuse my German, or from the Middle High German word for ford, Hab, in combination with one of the other forms for castle, which is Burg. Historians still argue exactly where the name came from. But it doesn't matter because the name stuck. the House of Habsburg fostered an impressive dynastic juggernaut all through the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. By 1276, Count Radbot's seventh generation descendant, Rudolf of Habsburg, had moved the family's power from its base at Habsburg Castle in Switzerland to the Duchy of Austria. Rudolf had become king of Germany, or rather the German states, I should say, since there really was no Germany yet, in 1273. And the dynasty of the House of Habsburg was truly entrenched in 1276 when Rudolf became the ruler of Austria, which the Habsburgs ruled until 1918, till the end of World War I. In 1440, the family ensconced itself in the lovely city of Vienna. Ever been to Vienna? A lovely city, indeed. Always go to a coffee shop and have the hot chocolate. It's to die for. It's to die for, okay? Which, of course, Vienna became the de facto capital of the Holy Roman Empire. A series of dynastic marriages enabled the family to vastly expand its domains to include Burgundy, Spain, and her colonial empire, as well as Bohemia, Hungary, and the other territories by virtue of inheritance. In the 16th century, the family separated into the senior Spanish Habsburgs and the junior Habsburg monarchy that mainly ruled Austria. In other words, they conquered Europe not by military action, but by cleverly arranging marriages. The Habsburgs were the champions at arranging strategic marriages of their sons and daughters to practically all the sons and daughters of Europe. The sons and daughters of the Habsburgs, I don't know if they had any say in all of this, but it didn't really matter because many of them became the crowned heads of Europe. Unfortunately, this meant that often blood relatives married each other, often creating a limited gene pool and led to several genetic problems. Now, I have a friend who's a geneticist, and she tells me that this has never been proven, that blood relatives marrying each other causes genetic defects. But she tells me there's a whole lot of evidence to support it, but no professional geneticist, and this is her opinion, not mine, and I'm saying this because I've read it in 100 books about the genetic defects brought about by these intermarriages, but she says, you know, Ed, that's never really been proven. Well, okay. I just thought I'd mention that. Several genetic problems when you take from a limited gene pool. One was the already discussed, I think I mentioned it before, the famous or infamous Habsburg jaw, in which the lower jawbone, the mandible, was deformed and enlarged, causing the mouth to hang open, making its owner look, well, stupid. Not to mention having difficulties eating. A hell of an underbite, or would that be an overbite? If you look at his jaw, see what Charles did was he covered it up with his beard. Men could cover it up with a beard. Women, I guess they just lived with it, okay? Charles did suffer from this malformation, but hid it. I sometimes wonder if Jay Leno's a Habsburg. He kind of has a pretty good sized lower jaw himself, doesn't he? You know, I've always thought he did. Some believe this may also have led to the introduction of the disease of hemophilia into many of the royal families of Europe. Most famously, the most famous case, of course, being Alexei, the son of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. Okay? Hemophilia. It's a weird disease. Primarily only affects men, but the female, the mother, is the carrier of the defective gene and passes it on to her sons, not to her daughters. But the daughters can carry the gene, but they don't contract hemophilia, a disease in which your blood doesn't clot. And if you bruise or cut yourself, you could literally bleed to death. Okay? Not a pleasant thing to have. Today, you can get I don't know if they still use this therapy or not, but you can get a shot of what is called the K-factor. I think it's called the K, no. It's called the factors, the K-factor or X-factor or something. Factor 9. That is it. Thank you very much. And that allows the blood to clot itself, okay? But earlier, generally, boys would die at a young age, simply by either skin their knee playing or bumping into something or what have you. Eventually, this may lead through multiple inheritance to a single Habsburg ruling almost all of Europe. And that's what we have here. That's what happened with Charles I. We have a single man, Charles I of Spain, ruling about 70% of Europe, especially after he became Holy Roman Emperor. Okay? This meant that he had a lot of titles. You know how they say, Elizabeth, by grace of God, the Queen of England and Ireland and Scotland, the defender of the faith, and they list her 2 or 3. Well, look at the titles. They're too numerous to read. These are the titles of Charles I. I'll let you read them.
What's the grave mean? Landgrave and Margrave?
I'll cover that when we get into Germany, because those are important titles of dealing with the Holy Roman Empire. They're important titles. I'll cover the graves when we get there. Wonder how long it took him to sign his check. Boy. That's a lot. That's a lot to have on your mind, isn't it? Okay?
You spent a lot of time in Jerusalem, though, I guess.
Some, but not much, no. After the crusade, the first crusade took Jerusalem, then all of the Catholic kings practically claimed themselves as king of Jerusalem. He wasn't the only one. Okay. And here are what those lands look like. All the colored in areas you see here. All the areas that have some color, be it red, be it maroon, be it yellow, orange, gold, whatever. Those are lands that belong to Charles. That's a lot of Europe. That's a lot of Europe there. And of course, this main part here by this black line, this is the Holy Roman Empire at that time. And almost all of this he inherited. As I said, just lucky, being in the right place at the right time. He just happened to be born to the right parents, and how hard is that? Okay? As mentioned earlier, Charles was the eldest son of Philip the Fair and Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. His grandmother was Isabella I of Castile. His grandfather was, of course, Ferdinand of Aragon. As the heir of 3 of Europe's leading dynasties, the House of Habsburg, or the Habsburg monarchy, the House of Valois-Burgundy of the Burgundian Netherlands, and the House of Trastamara, the crowns of Castile and Aragon. His holdings were vast, as you can see. Charles was born in the Flemish city of Ghent in 1500. The culture and courtly life of the Burgundian Low Countries were an important influence in his early life. He was tutored by William de Croix, who would later become his first prime minister, and also by Adrian of Utrecht, who later became Pope Adrian VI, one of the shortest reigning popes on record. He only reigned, I think he was only pope for about 2.5 to 3 months. It is said that Charles spoke several vernacular languages. He was fluent in French, Flemish, later adding an acceptable Spanish, which was required by the Castilian Cortes Generales as a condition of becoming king of Castile. A witticism sometimes attributed to Charles I is, and I quote, "I speak Spanish to God Italian to women, French to men, and German to my horse. After the death of his paternal grandfather, Maximilian, in 1519, he inherited the Habsburg monarchy. He was also the natural candidate of the electors to succeed his grandfather as Holy Roman Emperor. I'll tell you who the electors were when we get to the Holy Roman Empire. He defeated the candidacies of Frederick III, the Elector of Saxony, Francis I of France, and Henry VIII of England. The unanimous decision of the electors gave Charles the crown on June 28, 1519. He is therefore known as Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire and Charles I of Spain, same person. In 1530, he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Clement VII in Bologna, the last Holy Roman Emperor to receive a papal coronation. Remember who the first was? Charlemagne. Christmas Day in the year 800. Despite holding the imperial throne, Charles's real authority was limited by the German princes. It was Charles V, this guy, who summoned Martin Luther on the promise of safe conduct to the Diet of Worms, which resulted in the Pope's excommunication of Luther, which brought about the Protestant Reformation. Later, by the way, on his deathbed, he regretted not having Martin Luther executed on the spot. So at the age of 19, this ungainly youth controlled the largest empire since Charlemagne and probably the most powerful and rich since Rome. Unfortunately, he would be spending almost all of his time at war. But luckily, his opposition in Spain weakened. This was for a variety of reasons, but the most interesting of which was the situation with the nobility. Since the Reconquista, the Reconquest, and the discovery and conquering of America, Castile and Aragon now possessed many landed nobles who in Spain they called them hidalgos, the hidalgos. And aristocrats who naturally would be the internal enemies of any king since they envied his wealth and power. But the nobles were weak, enough that they could not pull off a real revolution without the support of the lower classes, which they constantly sought but never were able to achieve. But these lower classes also wanted power and real revolution and economic rights, and threatened to turn every revolt into a social revolution, which of course the nobles wanted nothing to do with. This is a story that will go on for centuries throughout the history of Spain. So the lower classes would always pull out. So consequently, Charles actually faced few serious threats on the home front. Just as well, because Charles's 40-year reign, of which he spent only 16 in Spain, involved an endless series of foreign conflicts in most of the rest of Europe. The self-proclaimed defender of the faith even made war on the Pope. And all Europe was shocked when imperial troops, under the command of Charles, went on a rampage and sacked Rome in 1527. One group of soldiers even camped out at the Vatican and built fires that damaged the Sistine Chapel. This remarkable event sprang from Spain's ongoing problems with France, now worsened by an equally perennial rivalry between the Habsburg and Valois dynasties. Milan was the main object of contention, and each side considered it vital to their interests. In a typically medieval gesture, Charles challenged the French king to a duel, personal combat, but at the Battle of Pavia decided the conflict in 1525, on the Spanish king's birthday, no less. Francis I was captured and briefly imprisoned in Madrid, where he remarked that all is lost but honor. The sacking of Rome occurred later, after the Pope created the Holy League of Cognac, an alliance that hastened the Habsburgs' awesome growth and power. The importance in all of this for Spain was in solidifying its Italian territories and alliances. which for almost 2 centuries would be the ballast of its imperial power in Europe, fully complemented by the wealth of gold and silver pouring in from its sprawling American empire. Charles took great interest in the New World, especially the aforementioned expeditions of Cortez and Pizarro, who conquered the 2 most advanced American Indian empires in America. Cortez, of course, defeated the Aztec in Mexico, and Pizarro defeated the Inca in Peru. Now, before we take our break, I think we got enough time to cover this one. Probably the most amazing thing that happened, I think, during Charles's reign is the voyage of Ferdinand Magellan, which, as you know, was the first expedition to circumnavigate the earth. Okay? Charles also, he was the sponsor of this incredible voyage of the Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan. Magellan was Portuguese, he was not Spanish. He was Portuguese. But he sailed for the crown of Castile. On September 20th, 1519, he left Spain. Sailed southwest across the Atlantic. Okay. After wintering over in what is now an Argentinian harbor, somewhere around in here, it got so cold, the sailors were scared to death. In fact, 1 or 2 of the ships, he left with 5 ships, panicked and left, went back. They left with 5 ships and 265 men. He made his way around the tip of South America through a strait, which today bears his name, the Straits of Magellan, into the Pacific Ocean, which he named, because it was real stormy as they rounded the tip of South America, and then all of a sudden the waves subsided and the water was peaceful. Pacific means peaceful. Then he had 3 months and thousands of miles of starvation and scurvy. Incredible bad luck as he crossed the Pacific Ocean, not knowing how big that ocean was. He struck out across the Pacific, not hitting hardly any islands at all. So there was no fresh food, which gives you scurvy. All your mucous membranes in your body, which coats your entire digestive system, dry up and bleed. You lose your teeth. It's a horrible disease, sometimes called the explorer's disease, because if you don't have, it was the British that figured out you need some vitamin C, which you get from fruits. And the British Navy you'd have to eat a lime a day. That's why we call them limeys. That's where they got the nickname. Okay. He landed first at Guam, which he claimed for Spain. Then he landed in the Philippines, which he also claimed for Spain and named after Charles's son, Philip, who will later become King Philip II of Spain. That's why they're called the Philippines. But he probably shouldn't have done that, because here Magellan was killed. He was killed in a battle with the natives over exactly how and under what circumstances they were going to convert to Christianity, or they changed their mind. Something like that happened. Killed by the locals, and the remainder of the expedition made its way to the Spice Islands, where they took on several spices. Then they crossed the Indian Ocean, just 1 ship left, and then rounded the Cape of Good Hope here, crossed the Atlantic again, at least the eastern Atlantic, and made their way back to Spain. The remainder of the expedition returned to Spain on September 6, 1522, just 2 weeks shy of 3 years after departing Spain, and they only came back with 1 ship and 19 starved, diseased sailors. This was the first circumnavigation of the world, taking almost 3 years. But when they got back, there was a huge problem. Well, it wasn't a huge problem. And I think, let's wait till after the break before I tell you what this huge problem was, because I want you to come back, okay? So let's take a 10 or 15 minute break, come back at 5 or 10 after, and we'll cover that. Anyway, as I said, something happened when they got back. Now, before I get to that, a little book report. Some of you have asked me, are there any good books out there that we could read about some of this stuff you're talking? So I decided to bring with me a few really good books. You can't have them, but I'm telling you what they are, okay? Remember when I talked about longitude? That's an incredible story. I love exploration. I love reading about explorers and voyages and things like that and all the horrendous problems they have and so forth. Here's what the jacket says. During the great ages of exploration, the longitude problem was the greatest scientific challenge of the time. Lacking the ability to determine their longitude, sailors were literally lost at sea as soon as they lost sight of land. Ships ran aground on rocky shores. Those traveling well-known routes were easy prey to pirates. In 1714, England's Parliament offered a huge reward, a fortune, to anyone whose method of measuring longitude could be proven successful. The scientific establishment, from Galileo to Sir Isaac Newton, had mapped the heavens in its certainty of a celestial answer to this problem. In stark contrast, one man, John Harrison, dared to imagine a mechanical solution, a clock that could keep precise time at sea, something no clock had been able to do even on land. And the race was on. And this is the story of John Harrison and how he made the simple, childish conclusion that since there are 360 degrees in a circle, there are then therefore 360 degrees of longitude around the Earth, from one point going east or west till you come back to the same point. You will traverse 360 degrees of longitude, although we only have 180 degrees of longitude because we cut the world in half into the eastern hemisphere and the western hemisphere. And since there are 24 hours in a day, if you divide 24 into 360, you get 15, which means every hour you traverse 15 degrees of longitude. If you knew what exact time it was where you left and what exact time it is here by noticing when the sun's at high noon, and check the two marine chronometers, they came to be called, you could determine your longitude with a great degree of certainty, depending upon how accurate you were able to measure the height of the sun overhead. So basically, he built clocks. He built clocks that he called H1, H2, H3, and H4, and these are all found in a museum at Greenwich in London. And they also have at Greenwich in London a patio with a marker that denotes the prime meridian, 0 degrees longitude, from which the world determines its longitude and counts its time. Okay, that's why they call it Greenwich Mean Time. An incredible story. Not only about coming up with it, but his battle, because he wanted the prize. He wanted to win the money. And Parliament, you're a commoner. Isaac Newton couldn't figure it out. Who do you think you are? And it took almost 100 years for his son finally to prove it. And he had to prove it by sailing to the West Indies and determining the longitude. He was within a degree of the correct answer. And Parliament, the king, George III, our friend, finally told Parliament, pay him, pay the man. And he got his money, but his son enjoyed it because he died at that time. The author, it's called Longitude, is the name of the book, and it's written by Dava Sobel. Dava Sobel. She's written several other books. She wrote one about Leonardo da Vinci's daughter, or Galileo's daughter. Excuse me. S-O-B-E-L. First name Dava, D-A-V-A. Dava Sobel. A great book. I read it in one sitting. I couldn't put it down. But as my wife says, I'm interested in kind of weird things, you know. So, and then talk about Magellan's voyage. Here's a great book called Over the Edge of the World, written by Lawrence Bergreen. It is a day-by-day, hour-by-hour, blow-by-blow description of the entire voyage. As it turns out, one of the sailors that accompanied Magellan, his name was Antonio Pigafetta, and he was a chronicler. He kept a diary, and his diary is about the only record we have. There was a problem with the logs they kept, which I'm going to be getting to in a minute. And the other thing is, I probably shouldn't say this, but I think you're all old enough. Pigafetta apparently was interested in the sexual practices of all of the native tribes that they encountered as they circled the world. So he spends what I think is an inordinate amount of time describing the sexual proclivities of the natives that they encountered. Now, I'm going to keep this on my person so you don't come and grab it away from me on the way out, all right?
Sounds like a sailor. Sounds like a
Yeah, he was a sailor. Over the Edge of the World, Lawrence Bergreen, I guess that's how you pronounce his name. And it's even, it's written in a kind of a faded, weird print, and the pages are real rough, so it's hard to, I guess to make it feel like it's kind of like his real diary. But interesting, I mean, talk about day by day, exactly what happened. Great book, great book.
And you were rubbing the pages too hard.
No. And then here's a book I've mentioned to you many times before. It's one of my favorite of all-time books. And it's written by William Manchester, who unfortunately is no longer with us. He died about 12, 13 years ago. The title of the book is A World Lit Only by Fire. An incredible book about the 16th century. A friend of his was writing a book about Magellan and asked William Manchester to write the foreword to it, which he did, but before he did some research on the 16th century, the 1500s, an incredible century, as you already know. And so he decided that this was so interesting, what his research led him to, that he wrote his own book. And it became an instant bestseller, a national bestseller, A World Lit Only by Fire. And I read portions of it too. Remember when I talked about the Borgia popes and the horrible things they did? Well, that was from this book. He also spends an inordinate amount of time on the problems of, well, never mind. You get the point. But the other thing about William Manchester is he is an historian. He is an historian's historian, and he writes very well. The only complaint I have about the way he writes, he's the one that wrote The Death of the President, about the assassination of JFK, which later on many people refuted, but no matter what you say about the assassination of JFK, it's going to get refuted, okay? But he loves to, he speaks in terms that are sometimes so subtle, they're too subtle. And I'm going to give you an example of that in the problem that arose upon the return of the survivors of Magellan's expedition when they returned to Spain. And he starts talking about it by making the point that oftentimes in history, things happen that we are not even aware of how important they are. Okay? And let me just read a couple of paragraphs to you, if you will. Historians, being intellectuals themselves, take a profound interest in the reflections and conclusions of learned men in the past. But most men in any age are unimpressed by new ideas. Many actually distrust them. In time, compelling thoughts may be translated into action. Then they may acquire tremendous force. Einstein's general theories of relativity were a joke to those who did not understand them. But those same people understood the atomic bomb, and their laughter died with Hiroshima. That time did not arrive for Copernicus in his lifetime. Now, you remember who Copernicus is? He's the one that offered the differing view that the sun is the center of the solar system rather than the Earth. And the book that he wrote that explained that theory, he wanted printed 5 years after his death, because he knew that this was a very, very controversial idea that had already resulted in the executions of several people and the near execution of the great Italian thinker Galileo himself for thinking the same thing. That time did not arrive for Copernicus in his lifetime. However, Magellan's voyage, a way station on the same journey as Copernicus's, had been common knowledge for over 20 years. As an event, not an idea, it had commanded instant attention. Couriers had galloped off to tell the Emperor, Charles V, and the Pope. The wonder came later. The wonder came later. Every day during the Armadas, that's the fleet that Magellan's expedition sailed around the world, every day during the Armada's long voyage, Pigafetta, the journalist I just told you about, had scrupulously dated every entry in his diary, beginning with Tuesday, September 20th, 1519. Their return to Spain, he noted, was on Saturday, September 6th. But the Spaniards ashore shook their head, insisting that it was Sunday, September 7th. Don Antonio checked with Albo, who on Magellan's instructions also kept a daily record in his ship's log. Albo clearly agreed with Pigafetta. Clearly, all Spain could not be wrong about so simple a fact as to what day this is. What's the dilemma? Somehow the flota, the Armada, had dropped 24 hours out of the calendar. What happened? Where did that day go? Behold the globe. Okay? Now, as you all know, the world is a sphere, and it's round, and it rotates. But which way does it rotate? Does it rotate this way, or this way, or this way? Huh? Which way does it rotate? It rotates this way. From west to east. From west to east. It rotates that way. Okay, that's why the sun rises in the east, appears to traverse our sky, and sets in the west, because we're all moving that way at about 1,000 miles an hour right now. You and I are really making some good time here, aren't we? Okay? Yeah. Well, while the earth was, when they left on their voyage, the earth was turning every day, making one complete revolution. They were traveling against the earth, weren't they? So in that almost 3 years, they made one circle of the earth, which meant that while the earth was turning this way, they completed one circumnavigation of the world in the opposite direction, which means you have to subtract a day, don't you? What if they had gone around twice? They would have lost 2 days, wouldn't they? What if they went east instead of west and crossed the Indian Ocean, then the Pacific Ocean, and then the Atlantic Ocean? They would have gained a day, wouldn't they? Okay? Well, so what? Big deal. What does this mean? This means that the earth rotates on its axis, and that the earth does not circle the sun. Or the sun does not circle the earth. It means that the earth is circling the sun, and the reason it appears that we're circling is because of the motion of the earth, which the Pope taught, and the church taught, and executed Giordano Bruno by burning him at the stake in the year 1600 in the city of Rome for saying what I just told you. And they almost executed Galileo too, but he retracted it. So they sentenced him to life in prison instead. House arrest. Okay? When they realized this, the king ordered the logs burned. Now, I don't think the king realized this right away, but when his learned scholars figured this out, they thought, wait a minute. If this is true, then Copernicus is right, and the church is wrong. And if we go around telling people this, they're going to execute us too. So burn the logs. Burn the logs. There are no logs left over from Magellan's voyage today. They're gone. They're gone. Okay? Pretty important, huh? Yeah.
Is that why we have a leap year?
No. No, leap year we have because our way of counting the length of a year is too short. Okay? I covered that one time about our calendar. By the time Pope Gregory in 1582 invented the Gregorian calendar, the Julian calendar was 10 days behind where it should have been, or 10 days ahead. I think it was 10 days ahead. And so he invented the Gregorian calendar to replace the Julian calendar. And how did he do away with the 10 days? By throwing those 10 days out the window and moving the date up 10 days, which the Catholic world did, but the Protestant world said, you're full of it. We're not doing that, until they realized he was right. And then they one by one did, and one of the last countries to do it was Russia. Yeah. But we added the leap year because we added that leap day, February 29th, every 4 years, but that overdid it a little bit. So every once in a while we have to not add one. So if the century year is divided by 400, like in the year 1600 and like in the year 2000, even though we had a leap year 4 years before, we didn't have a leap year in that year. We did not have a leap year. We went from February 28th to March 1st. Yeah. Yeah.
How much of the geography of the world was known when Magellan made his trip?
Not much. Like I said, he had no idea how big the Pacific Ocean was.
But look at his route. He went down hugging South America.
Yeah.
But when he came back, he didn't go straight across and hit America and then go down the coastline.
No, because this route was already known. The Portuguese had already, in fact, Magellan had already sailed from Portugal years earlier to the Moluccas, the East Indies. And he had spent time there and sailed back. And by the way, when he was there, he acquired a slave which he named Henry. And Enrique was with him for the rest of his life. So actually, when Magellan was sailing this way, west, when he reached the Moluccas, who was the first man to circumnavigate the world? It wasn't Magellan, was it? It was Enrique, his slave. Because when he made it back to the Moluccas, he had circumnavigated the world and was therefore the first man to do so. But he was a slave and nobody cared.
Like Clark and Lewis and Clark, he had his slave with him when they explored went across America.
Yeah, I guess so. I didn't know that. Right, yes. Well, that comes along much later. Much later, the international date line. There was no international date line at that time. That had to be settled. That was settled around, I believe, around the time that we settled upon the prime meridian going through Greenwich, England, which was settled in 1884. Because up till that time, every nation considered the line of longitude that went through its capital to be the prime meridian. So if you were sailing on an American ship, well, the prime meridian went through Washington, D.C. If you were sailing on a Spanish ship, it went through Madrid. On a French ship, it went through Paris. On an English ship, of course, it went through London or Greenwich. And it was a mess, so all the geographers got together and said, you know, this is a mess. Let's all agree. And since, as the song says, Britannia ruled the waves, Britain got its way. The one that went through London became the prime meridian. And 180 degrees on the other side became, in essence, the international date line. Today, the international date line goes like this. Because of certain possessions, and they don't want to change the day, then some island groups and so forth. Yeah.
What were the Spice Islands?
They were in the Moluccas, this whole area here. This whole area here were the Spice Islands, rich in cinnamon, cloves. What was the other one? That once, and by the way, Magellan's crew grabbed a bunch of cloves, I believe it was. They took a whole shipment of cloves, as much as they could store on board, and when they got back, they sold it for a fortune. A fortune. When da Gama sailed from Portugal to India and back, he loaded about 3 ships with pepper and sold the pepper for 60 times the cost of the entire voyage. And he was gone for well over a year on that voyage. Well, this is this kind of pepper, this kind of pepper. So what do you think of that? Is that stuff exciting or what? Yeah, I like this kind of stuff, yeah.
What were the Spice Islands' real name?
Well, they didn't really have a real name. The Portuguese called them the Moluccas.
And that was what now?
Well, today they're like the island of Celebes. Celebes, which is this island, let's see, which one is it? I think it's this one right here.
Just to the east of Borneo, yeah.
Yeah, right there, east. Yeah, here's Borneo right here. Yeah, these islands right here were the Spice Islands, which eventually were taken by the Dutch, believe it or not. The Dutch eventually controlled the spice trade. In order to win their independence from Spain, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but in order to win their independence from Spain, they built a huge navy. And after they defeated Spain and got their independence, they said, well, what are we going to do with this big navy? Well, they decided to go grab the Spice Islands. They had them all the way through World War II. Dutch Indonesia was basically included, that whole area there. But they discovered oil there too, which became more valuable than the spices, as we all know. Okay. Okay, this is sometimes called the Magellanian Dilemma, when they couldn't figure out what day it was. And once they did, mum's the word. Mum's the word, okay? Oh, and by the way, how come it says, did any of you notice this? Magellan's voyage. Magellan's. Come on, Rich, you usually spot things like that all the time. Anyway, I don't know. I don't know why it's that way. I didn't do it.
A question, Ed.
Yeah.
The Pope had divided the world into half Portuguese and half Spanish.
Well, not quite half and half, but
But
he drew a line.
But technically, wasn't the Spice Islands in the Portuguese part of it?
Yeah, they were. They were. And when the Spanish sailed through there, they had to be very careful. The Portuguese would have fired on them on sight.
At that time, the Portuguese were already in India.
Yeah, they were. That's why they didn't land in India. They crossed the Indian Ocean across the south, because they knew what latitude this was. So as soon as they left the Philippines and got onto the open sea, they struck out for that latitude so they could round it and go back home. See their friends and relatives. Okay? Okay. Well, we're not through with Charles yet. Let's talk about Spain under Charles. I got a map out of order here. Back to Charles. The marriage of Charles to Isabella, the beautiful daughter of the Portuguese king, further endeared him with the Spaniards. They would have 3 children, including the future king Philip II, or Felipe II. One of the king's infrequent extramarital affairs resulted in the birth of a man who became very famous in literature and all over Europe at the time. He was known as Don Juan of Austria, who became a great figure in the future military history of Europe, not to mention his numerous love affairs with some of the most prominent women of Spain, making his name synonymous with womanizing in the process. Charles also impressed his subjects when he learned Spanish and insisted on speaking it. One time, when he was interrupted by a French bishop, he retorted, "Do not expect to hear from me in any language but Castilian." And I told you about the witticism about what he spoke to. You know, he spoke Spanish, Spanish or Latin, depending on the source, Italian to women, French to men, German to his horse. And by the way, there's a similar quote about that that can be found in Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. He makes a similar point. As mentioned before, Spain was ruled as part of a large and complicated dynastic order in which each local region retained its own laws and customs. Apart from the Inquisition, there was no unifying institution shared by all of Spain. Charles was King of Castile and Aragon, not King of Spain, although historians, and I will from time to time say, for all intents and purposes, he was the de facto. In fact, he was the King of Spain, but legally, technically, no. Okay? Unfortunately, Castile ended up footing the bill for Charles's endless wars, sumptuous extravagance, and incessant travels. The money came from taxes and the rapidly growing income from the Indies, which reached phenomenal figures by the 1540s. However, it was delusional to base imperial power on Castilian resources alone. Other segments of the empire also contributed to this, notably Italy, and the wealth in trade it brought in were vital in financing many of these Spanish aspirations. Unfortunately, the financial and human investment in war begun by Charles continued for 2 centuries and became the major reason for Spain's ultimate decline. Another threat to Catholicism came from the Ottoman Empire, which was the map that was just up there, and their allies along the Barbary coast of North Africa, bringing about conflict with the old Muslim foes again. Ottomans were not Arabs, but they were Muslims. Let's see. Throughout the 16th century, the East and the West Mediterranean were 2 political zones under 2 banners, Turkish and Spanish, and great battles occurred wherever they met. Ottomans were ruled by another larger-than-life figure named Suleiman the Magnificent, who took charge in 1520 and reigned 46 years, almost identical to Charles's reign. The struggle commenced when Turks swept up through the Balkans and threatened Vienna, the seat of Habsburg power and source of their inheritance. Here they were paired in a heroic defense involving thousands of Spanish troops. The Turks were even more fearsome at sea. In 1529, they seized Algiers, and Tunis fell 5 years later. The Spanish coastline itself was under constant threat from these resurgent Muslims, compounded by the presence of Moriscos, who were converted Muslims to Christians, of questionable loyalty. Spain was paying the price for not carrying the reconquest into North Africa itself. Even today, the Spanish coast, especially Andalusia, the whole southern part of Spain, is dotted with scores of hilltop watchtowers. Most date from this period to about 1600 and were designed to form a network of fire and smoke to warn coastal residents of imminent attack. This explains why most of the original seaside pueblos were lodged in the hills well away from immediate danger rather than along the coast itself. Spain's battle-hardened army was Europe's best at the time, though it was small and depended greatly on foreign allies, of which there were many thanks to Charles's many kingdoms he ruled. The new Spanish infantry organization was called the Tercio. The Tercio, which included regiments of 2,000 or 3,000 soldiers divided into pikemen, swordsmen, and cavalry, and was as significant for military history as the birth of the Greek phalanx or the Roman legion. But the Spanish Navy was relatively weak until the reign of Charles's successor, Philip II. Nevertheless, in 1535, Charles assembled one of the century's greatest expeditions, involving 400 ships and 30,000 troops to attack Tunis. This daring move was a resounding success. As leader of the Barbary pirates, Oric Barbarossa fled, and thousands of Christian slaves were freed from their shackles. It was a high-water mark for Charles. Unfortunately, his follow-up assault on Algiers 6 years later ended in failure, with the loss of 150 ships and 12,000 men, It was a resounding defeat for Charles, a disaster in every sense, and became his last expedition against Islam. The Western Mediterranean remained in the grip of the Barbary pirates. Among those who fought at Algiers, by the way, the debacle battle, was a man of some experience, Hernan Cortés, future conqueror of Mexico. New World policies. Of utmost importance at this stage in Spain's history is Spain's governance of its valuable American empire. With the passing of the throne from the Trastamara dynasty to the now Habsburg dynasty, this becomes a major topic. As it turns out, Charles, for the most part, continued Isabella and Ferdinand's policies with respect to ruling the Spanish holdings in North and South America. There are also a lot of misconceptions as far as this topic is concerned. For example, the subject of slavery of the American Indians is one of the most contentious topics in all of American history, especially as more and more historians jump on the bandwagon of condemning people who lived centuries ago using today's attitudes. In point of fact, the Spanish crown actually forbade and outlawed the enslaving of Indians and issued edicts to that effect as early as 1500. Indeed, Isabella herself, at the behest of Spanish theologians, openly criticized Columbus for his treatment of the Indians. But that was before everyone realized that this was not the Far East, where slavery was already in vogue, as it was practically in the rest of the world since the beginning of time. Once the Spanish realized that these Native Americans were a hitherto unknown people and not East Asians, they considered it their duty to westernize and Christianize them. Of course, once again, today this would be frowned upon as complete denigration of their culture and an act of extreme racism. But once again, if you judge people from the past using today's mores or terms of what is right and wrong, you would be holding them to a standard they had no chance to meet, since they did not live in our present times. We must remember that, in a sense, when studying history, it is their history we are studying, not ours. I know people love to draw parallels between the past and the present, but remember, those who acted out the history we're studying had no knowledge of our present ways of life and attitudes. It's sort of a mean trick we play on the dead. It's best to study history as they lived it. They being those who acted out the events under discussion. Most all historians concur that the Spanish truly believed they were doing the right thing by bringing Christianity in hopes that they too could enjoy the fruits of salvation, which of course they believed in sincerely. But those who have jumped on the just mentioned bandwagon will not be swayed, unfortunately, especially in this argument, since most of them don't believe in traditional concept of salvation anyway. Most of them are atheists. So in their minds, negating what the Spanish believe is totally unimportant to them. Doesn't mean a thing. How this looks today is actually irrelevant as far as 16th century Spaniards are concerned. I know I just can't, I know you're probably saying to yourself, can't he fight the urge to keep bringing this up? But I do in the hope that I hope I am beating a dead horse, although I didn't kill the horse. All right? However, having said all that, does not change the fact that another great tragedy unfolds here. During most of the colonial era, and by the way, here you can see the areas that everything was divided up. South America was divided up into various, and so, you know, the Viceroyalty of Peru, New Granada, and later on the borders were changed. And in North America, this is the New Spain, the Viceroyalty of New Spain, and so forth. It includes what is today Mexico, and so forth. During most of the colonial area, Spanish American society had a pyramidal structure. See, let's get to that. A pyramidal structure with a small number of Spaniards at the top, a group of mixed race people beneath them, and at the bottom, a large indigenous population and small number of slaves, usually of Indian and African origin. Although the size of these groups varied within regions and fluctuated over the course of 3 centuries, they comprised the hierarchy of power and social status during most of the colonial period and even continued into the post-independence period. When the new society in Spanish America developed over the next century, it will contain 4 or 5 classes. At the top were the peninsulars, or the peninsulares in Spanish, best defined as Spanish-born Spaniards, people who were born in Spain. They're here in America, but they were born in Spain, and they considered home to be Spain. And they fully intended someday to go back home. Next came the Creoles, or the Creoles, or American-born Spaniards. These were either born in Spain or closely descended from someone born in Spain, or they were born here in America, descended from somebody born in Spain. But unlike the Peninsulares, they considered America to be their home. They were here to stay. They were settlers. And many of them became landowners. Despite their racial similarity, enmity developed between these 2 groups who made up the upper class of Spanish society. Mestizos and mulattoes came next. These are those of mixed blood. Since few Spanish women came to America in the early going, many Spanish men married Indian women, and later African women. This group will ultimately make up the huge majority of what is today referred to as Latin America. Probably 80 to 90% of Mexico today are descendants of this group. Beneath them are the still racially unmixed Indians and Africans. This group has been shrinking since October 12, 1492, due mainly to disease, and is still shrinking due to intermarriage, which, depending upon which theory of race one subscribes to, and believe me, you want to tread very lightly when you discuss with anyone what theory of race there is. When I was in school, I took an anthropology class, or geography of man class, which basically taught me there were 9 geographic races in the world, and so on and so forth. And that race was a genetic thing. It's not a state of mind. When you talk about state of mind, I was taught you're talking about ethnicity, not race. One can change their ethnicity, one can change their nationality, but one couldn't change their race because it's part of your genetic makeup, and you can't change it. Now, if that's the case, the anthropologists back in those days, and I'm talking about the 60s, told me that if someone is the product of 2 different parents from 2 different races, then the whole concept of race does not apply to them. Ethnicity can, but not race. And let me tell you something, if I taught that today, I'd be fired the next day because race has undergone an entirely new definition. And gee, I don't even want to get involved in it, okay? Because it's very emotional. People can get very emotional when you talk about this, okay? Starting almost immediately, and by the way, when we separate the classes, in history and in early sociology, when we talk about, this is what we call the social structure. The social structure means the classes. Unfortunately, I'm not saying it's not a good thing. We humans, we lump ourselves into groups. We probably shouldn't do that because everybody should be equal, right? And everybody should, there's not even such a thing as male and female anymore, is there? Oh no, there are other, you can determine whatever gender you want to be now, okay? Well, back in the 60s, that's not what I was taught, okay? And so when we listed the classes, because we humans rank ourselves into classes often based on anything. It could be based on race, it could be based on wealth, it could be based on anything. Well, after we list, what we do is we list the races, and we always start at the top, like I just did, with the Peninsulares, But then after we list the races, we draw a line. Because regardless of how many classes in a traditional society means pre-industrial, regardless of how many classes you list, in pre-industrial societies and traditional societies, there are only two classes, the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. There was no middle class. The middle class is a construct of the Industrial Revolution. We are all in this class except for Barry. Barry's in the extreme upper class. Okay? But all the rest of us are members of the great middle class. And we have the Industrial Revolution to thank for that. Okay? Never mind. Regardless, and if you're dealing with a pre-industrial society, which is what this is, there are only two classes, so where do we draw the line? Where's the rich and the poor? Where's the have and have-nots? Right here. You draw the line right across here. The Peninsulares and the Creoles were the upper class. Everybody else are the low classes. Plain and simple. Plain and simple. Okay? Now, starting almost immediately with Spanish colonization, once they decided, hey, these are not East Asians. These are some new group of people. We'll call them Indians. We'll call them Native Americans. We'll call them, Canada calls them first citizens. Call them whatever you want. But these are not who we thought they were. So while we try to handle them and deal with all this, large tracts of land were granted to the Creoles, the settlers, by the monarchy if they promised to, quote, develop the land and civilize the Indians. And you could be handed, almost the entire area of North Orange County here was part of the great Yorba land grant, in which the Yorba family was granted almost all of North Orange County by the King of Spain, way back in the 16th century. All he had to do was develop the land, he grew oranges, and civilized the Indians, okay? Now, this led to the establishment of what became known as the encomienda system, and by civilize the Indians was meant teach them Christianity and Western ways, which once again today would be 99 and 100% racism, wouldn't it? Yes, it would. But here is where things went awry. Here's where the tragedy comes along. By civilize the Indians was meant teach them Christianity and Western ways, as I just said. The king decreed that the Creole landowners had the right to be compensated for these tasks. Since the Indians had no money, they could therefore only offer one thing in payment for the Spanish lessons and the Christian lessons and all of that. They could only offer their labor. Instead, this is what became known as the peonage system. Peonage, whereby the Indians worked to pay off their debt to the landowner. Problem was, they almost never paid off the debt. So for all intents and purposes, peonage became a form of slavery, despite the good intentions of the Spanish. Of course, here is also where the Indians became infected with the European diseases and died off by the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. So one tragedy begat another. But it's not over. As the Indians died off, their labor died off also. But the Spanish-American colonies still needed large-scale labor. So here, starting with the Portuguese in their colony of Brazil, began to import Africans as slaves. And thus began the other great tragedy of post-Columbian America, the African slave trade, which became so lucrative that European nations went to war to get the contracts to supply slaves to America from Africa. They had access to large numbers, the Portuguese that is, had access to a large number of African slaves through the Africans themselves. Africans were not as susceptible to European diseases as Native Americans were. Therefore, at first the asiento, that's what these contracts were called, the asiento, which means consent. Since Portugal, not Spain, had colonized the west coast of Africa, they had access to a lot of these Africans. Therefore, as the first asiento was granted to the Portuguese, but the African slave trade became so profitable that, as mentioned, wars were fought for the privilege. The Dutch, the English, who passed it on to the South Sea Company, and later the Genoese from Genoa in Italy, among others, took over the trade. Between 1518 and 1800, dozens of nations, companies, city-states, and individuals were granted the asiento. Ironically, it also added such a horrible new twist to this age-old institution that its horribleness eventually ended it, at least in official status. But even though in Latin America the results are essentially the same for Indians and Africans, despite Spanish attempts to make it otherwise. By that I mean the ton of evidence that the enslavement of the Indians was not their intention, and that the Spanish were sincere in their desire to uplift the Indians they found in America. Remember, we were speaking here of a world in which slavery was practically as common as night and day. In fact, many historians have come to the conclusion that the Spanish Empire, judged by standards of its day, was one of history's most humane. The clergy publicly criticized the atrocities of the crown, and the crown listened and took action. New laws published in 1542 forbade the enslavement of Indians and lashed out at the abuses of the already mentioned encomienda system and granted protection for Indian rights. Charles even suspended all further conquests until a debate could be held on the morality issues affecting treatment of the native populations. How many monarchs can you name who have ever done that? Or even modern presidents or prime ministers, for that matter. Of course, these measures fell far short of ending the mistreatment of the Indians, especially after the discovery of silver in Mexico. Mexico, by the way, is still the world's #1 producer of silver. Okay, a lot of people don't realize that. Conditions in the Mexican silver mines were horrific. And also significant consideration is that none of these measures affected African slavery. Okay? Okay. How about we stop there? It's getting to be that time. So, I think our next class is, what did you say, Barry? The 23rd of July. We only have 2 more classes to go. So it looks like our study of Spain is going to stretch into the fall. I don't know if that's good news or bad news, but that's the way it's going to be, okay? Thanks for coming. See you next time. Thank you very much.